If I ask most Linux users to name the distribution that is doing the most damage to Windows right now, they will say Zorin OS or Linux Mint, maybe Ubuntu. These are the names that come up in every conversation about Windows migration. The distribution that is actually doing the most structural damage to Windows in 2026 is one that most of those same people have never installed and possibly never heard of. It is called Bazzite. It is not trying to look like Windows. It is not trying to appeal to Windows migrants. It does not have a Windows-style taskbar or a desktop layout preset or a migration wizard. It does not care about any of that. What it does is make Linux the better operating system for gaming. Not equal, better, on specific hardware that tens of millions of people own. And in 2026, that is the most damaging thing any Linux distribution can do to Windows, because gaming was the last remaining argument that Windows was better at something that everyday users actually care about. Bazzite is a Linux distribution built on Fedora Atomic. If you do not know what Fedora Atomic is, that is part of why nobody talks about Bazzite. It is not built on Ubuntu. It is not a beginner-friendly migration tool. It does not care about making you feel at home if you are coming from Windows. It is built for gaming performance on Linux, and its target audience is people who already know they want Linux and already know they want to game. The combination is more powerful than it sounds. Bazzite is the 2026 benchmark for gaming-first Linux. Built on Fedora Atomic, a cloud-native variant, it delivers the same console-like experience you get on Steam Deck, but fully optimized for desktop PCs with hybrid GPUs, NVIDIA drivers, AMD RDNA support, and Intel Arc cards all pre-configured. What makes Bazzite stand out is its attention to gaming detail. Mango HUD, VK Basalt, and OBS VK capture ship pre-installed. The kernel includes HDR support, expanded hardware compatibility patches, and tuning for reduced latency. Mango HUD is an FPS overlay that shows frame rate, GPU temperature, CPU utilization, and frame time in real time during gaming. VK Basalt applies post-processing filters to games that do not natively support them. OBS VK Capture is a zero overhead video capture tool that records games without the performance hit of traditional screen capture. These are not tools most Windows gamers know exist. They are tools that, once you have used them, you do not want to go back to gaming without. All three are pre-installed, not available in a package manager somewhere, pre-installed, configured, ready to use on first boot. The Fedora Atomic base is what separates Bazzite from distributions like Pop, Bosch OS, or Manjaro for gaming. Fedora Atomic uses an immutable system architecture. The operating system image is read-only. Updates replace the entire image atomically. If an update breaks something, you boot the previous image from a menu selection, no recovery mode, no command line rescue, just boot last known good and continue. For a gaming machine that you update regularly and cannot afford to have broken during a gaming session, this is not a philosophical preference, it is a practical necessity. The reason Bazzite is doing structural damage to Windows is not its architecture or its pre-installed tools, it is the performance numbers. Bazzite and CachyOS achieved 1 to 3% higher frame rates than Ubuntu on identical hardware, primarily due to kernel tuning and optimized packages. 1 to 3% over Ubuntu is already meaningful. But the comparison that matters most is not Bazzite versus Ubuntu. It is Bazzite versus Windows 11 on the same hardware. The Prime-Agent, who switched to Linux as his daily driver in 2023, addressed gaming performance head-on. If you are a competitive FPS player who needs every frame, Windows is still the answer. But for the 90% of gamers playing single-player or casual multiplayer, Proton just works now. I have not booted into Windows for gaming in over a year. That observation, from a developer with one of the largest audiences in the programming community, represents exactly what Bazzite has accomplished. Not that Linux gaming is equal to Windows gaming, that Linux gaming is good enough for the vast majority of what people actually play, combined with an out-of-box experience that is in specific ways better than Windows. The specific ways better: no Copilot running in the background, consuming RAM, no telemetry processes, no update service waking up during a gaming session, no advertising infrastructure, no background AI services. The machine that runs Bazzite is, from the moment it boots, pointed entirely at running your games rather than divided between running your games and running Microsoft services. Ubuntu 24.04, LTS achieved 1 hours in a simulated workday test compared to 2 hours for Windows 11 Pro, a 26% improvement. This battery life gap exists because Linux's lower background process overhead allows the CPU to reach deeper sleep states more frequently. For gaming laptops, where battery life during casual play or light sessions matters, the Linux advantage translates directly to more time between charges. The RAM efficiency gap is the most striking single number in the entire Windows versus Linux comparison. MKBHD highlighted the RAM efficiency gap in his 2025 year-end roundup, noting, The fact that a fresh Linux install uses less than a quarter of the RAM that Windows needs before you even open an app, that is the kind of efficiency that makes you rethink what minimum specs actually means. Less than a quarter. Windows 11 at idle uses 3 to 4, 2 gigabytes. Bazzite at idle uses under 1 gigabyte. On a gaming PC with 16 gigabytes of RAM, the difference between 4 gigabytes consumed by the OS and 1 gigabyte consumed by the OS is 3 gigabytes available to your game. To your game's VRAM streaming cache, to your voice chat application, to whatever else you have running alongside the game. The place where Bazzite has done the most direct, documented, measurable damage to Windows is not on desktop gaming PCs. It is on gaming handhelds. The Steam Deck runs SteamOS, which is the closest relative to Bazzite. When Valve certified SteamOS for third-party AMD handheld hardware in 2025, Bazzite became the community-preferred alternative for handheld gaming on devices that wanted the full Bazzite experience rather than Valve's more locked-down SteamOS. Best handheld Linux gaming in 2026, Steam Deck OLED 1TB plus Bazzite, or official Steam Deck plus SteamOS 3. 8. The Lenovo Legion Go S shipped with SteamOS in May 2025. The Legion Go 2 SteamOS was announced at CES 2026 in January. Every review of these devices compared the Windows version to the SteamOS or Bazzite version and reached the same conclusion. The Linux-based operating system delivers better frame rates, better battery life, and a better out-of-box experience for a device designed to be held in two hands and navigated with thumbsticks. Gizmodo's CES 2026 coverage described the Legion Go 2 SteamOS as offering a better operating system at a slightly cheaper price. That quote, from a major mainstream technology publication reviewing a flagship gaming handheld from the world's largest PC manufacturer, is the most direct statement of what Bazzite and its SteamOS relative have accomplished. Not that Linux gaming is viable, but Linux gaming is better on this hardware. Windows was supposed to be the gaming operating system. That was the core competitive argument Microsoft had against Linux in the gaming space. The argument was not just true, it was so obviously true that it barely needed to be made. And Bazzite, SteamOS, and the ecosystem of gaming-focused Linux distributions have spent 5 years making that argument false for a specific and growing category of gaming hardware. Bazzite is now achieving 150,000 monthly ISO downloads as of early 2026. This number received almost no mainstream press coverage. Zorin OS's 3 million downloads in 6 months generated extensive coverage from Windows Central, Tech Republic, NeoWin, and every major technology publication. Bazzite's 150,000 monthly downloads were covered almost exclusively in gaming-adjacent Linux forums and a few specialist outlets. The difference in coverage is explained by audience. Zorin OS users are Windows migrants, people who did not expect to switch and who the mainstream press can write ordinary person switches to Linux stories about. Bazzite users are gamers and developers who made a deliberate, informed choice. The mainstream press does not tell person who knew exactly what they wanted and got it stories as readily as person who discovered a new thing stories. But 150,000 monthly downloads of a gaming-focused Linux distribution is not a rounding error. It is, for comparison, roughly equivalent to all Steam Deck hardware sales in a typical month. The population of people choosing a gaming-first Linux distribution is growing. It is measurable, and it is drawn almost entirely from people who were previously gaming on Windows. Atomic and immutable distro growth, Aaron OS, Fedora Silverblue, and other Atomic distros are gaining mainstream traction for their zero-breakage upgrade workflows. Bazzite is part of this broader trend toward Atomic Linux distributions. The same properties that make Bazzite good for gaming, reliable updates with automatic rollback, make the immutable architecture model appealing for everyday computing. As Bazzite's audience grows beyond dedicated Linux gaming enthusiasts to people who want a gaming PC that also handles everyday computing tasks reliably, the comparison to Windows as a daily driver becomes direct. This video would be incomplete without the parts of the gaming on Linux story that Bazzite has not yet solved. Winner, Windows. Despite Proton's progress, competitive games like Valorant still do not run on Linux. Even where games run, the 17 to 25% performance penalty on most hardware matters in competitive scenarios where every frame counts. NVIDIA's RTX features, DLSS, and ray tracing perform better on Windows drivers. If you play exclusively on Steam and avoid anti-cheat heavy titles, Linux is viable. But for the broadest compatibility and peak performance, Windows remains the only realistic choice for serious gamers in 2026. Valorant does not run on Bazzite. It uses kernel-level anti-cheat that is designed specifically to detect and reject non-Windows environments. Current Fortnite has the same issue. Competitive players whose primary game uses kernel-level anti-cheat remain on Windows, not because Windows is better at gaming generally, but because one specific technical implementation blocks Linux specifically. The 17 to 25% performance penalty exists on some hardware in some games, though 1 to 3% advantage Bazzite achieves over Ubuntu is not a universal Windows beating result. The actual performance comparison between Bazzite and Windows varies by game, by GPU generation, by driver version, and by whether the game has a native Linux port or runs through Proton. On AMD hardware, the performance gap has largely closed or reversed. On NVIDIA hardware, the gap is smaller than it was, but still exists in some configurations and for some ray tracing and DLSS workloads. The Steam hardware survey shows Linux at approximately 2% of Steam users in early 2026, up from 4% in early 2024. That number is more conservative than the Distro Watch Adjacent figures that show higher Linux gaming adoption. The Steam hardware survey measures active Steam library usage on non-Steam Deck hardware, which is a specific subset of the Linux gaming population. The Steam Deck accounts for a significant portion of Linux gaming hours that appear in other measurements, but are counted separately in some Steam survey methodologies. The honest number for Linux's gaming share is somewhere between 2% and 5%, depending on what is being measured. Neither number is Windows threatening at a market scale level. Both numbers are growing in a trajectory that was not visible 5 years ago. Here is the argument for why Bazzite and gaming-focused Linux are more structurally significant than the migration-focused distributions that receive most of the coverage. The people who switched from Windows to Zorin OS and Linux Mint because Windows 10 lost support were pushed out by a deadline. The people who switched because of the October 2025 end of life were responding to an event external to Windows product quality. Many of them might have stayed on Windows indefinitely if the deadline had not forced a decision. The people who are on Bazzite chose to be there. They chose a gaming-first Linux distribution over Windows gaming for a reason that has nothing to do with Microsoft's support lifecycle decisions. They chose it because the gaming experience was better for their specific hardware and their specific games. That is a qualitative preference choice, not a forced migration. Qualitative preference choices are more durable. The Windows 10 migrant who switched to Zorin OS because of a deadline might switch back when Windows 12 arrives, if the migration experience is smooth enough. The gamer who switched to Bazzite because the frame rates were better and the battery lasted longer, and there were no background services interrupting their session, has fewer reasons to go back to Windows, because the thing that drove them there was a genuine quality difference rather than a deadline. The distributions nobody talks about that are doing structural damage to Windows are doing it by being genuinely better at something Windows users care about. Bazzite is doing it for gaming. The conversation about Linux migration usually focuses on the distributions that are making the switch easier for users who are abandoning Windows. The more significant long-term story might be the distributions that are attracting users who are actively choosing Linux over Windows for quality reasons. 150,000 monthly downloads of a gaming Linux distribution that nobody in mainstream tech press writes about regularly. The distro nobody talks about is quietly doing what many thought would never happen, making Linux the better gaming platform for a growing share of the hardware where it runs.